Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for this morning, or I guess afternoon, depending where you are, webinar, Navigating AFCCA Together, a guide for family supporters. My name is Catherine, and I am your community engagement liaison, and I have the privilege of introducing our incredible presenters with Interwoven Connections, formerly known as Adopt for Life, a community that represents a tapestry of families and relationships formed through adoption, kinship, and customary care, creating spaces and experiences where parents and caregivers can feel seen and heard, providing access to trauma-sensitive services and supports at every stage of your journey. We are so very honored to have so many of you with us today within Ontario and beyond, as we share information that was specifically designed for the extended networks of families living with AFCCA. Before I share how we'll be using this platform and introduce our incredible speakers, I do want to pause and take acknowledgements for the lands that we are situated on today. I understand that we're coming from various places within the world, so I just ask for you to take time and reflect on the personal territory in treaty where you reside. I personally reside in the territory of Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and Mississaugas of the Credits people within Treaty 19, now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and our responsibility in improving relationships between nations, and as a step towards improving our own understanding of local Indigenous people and their cultures, to recognize and perhaps more importantly, acknowledge the historic and ongoing devastating effects of colonialism and racism in the name of assimilation across Canada, and to consider how we each can, in our own ways, action forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. As long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows. We do want this to be an engaging and interactive webinar, so please feel free to use the chat feature for anything like tech-related issues, if you want to share comments or engage with any of the content. We also would love to know where you guys are logging in from. I know a few people have already done that, so please feel free to jot down the city that you're coming in so we can say hi to you. We invite you to use the closed captioning feature if you'd like to enhance your understanding of the audio or for any sort of accommodation needs as well. If you have specific questions for the AFCCA team, we ask that you use the Q&A feature. So this is if you have a question around the content, there is going to be time specifically at the end of this webinar to ask questions and share a bit more resources. With the Q&A feature, you do have the option of asking things anonymously if preferred. Please note that we may not get to all of the questions. They're going to try their absolute best. However, following this, you will get a copy of this recording as well as any relevant questions and resources that you may need. If you are watching this, if you are watching this on the recording, please know that you're also welcome to ask questions. So you can email us at AFCCA support, AFFCA support at interwovenconnections.ca, and I'll make sure to put that in the comments as well. So without further ado, I am pleased to introduce our presenters for this morning. Erin is a peer connector with Interwoven Connections and is a proud mother of one who she adopted at age 7. She met her son while working as an educational assistant and with her wife began the adoption process. With over 10 years of experience in education, mental health, and autism programs, Erin is dedicated to supporting vulnerable children and families. She specializes in trauma-informed care, therapeutic parenting, ADHD, intellectual disabilities, offering supports and compassion throughout all life stages. Last but certainly not least is Maude. She is our AFCCA clinical lead who brings extensive clinical research as well as personal experiences to Interwoven Connections. She is a mother of 5 children, both through birth and adoption, all of whom were older adoptees. Maude has a PhD in neuroscience from Queen's University, specializing in FASD, trauma, aggression towards family caregivers. She's a registered social worker and psychotherapist with an MSW focused on raising children with FASD and developmental trauma. Maude plays a key role in implementing the FASD Key Worker Program in Vancouver and Ottawa. As a bilingual speaker, she is sought after expert and passionately shares her resources to support families. I do want to say this is like just a small clipping of how amazing both these women are. So I'm going to give you their full bios in the link in case you're wondering just how amazing they are. So with that said, that's enough of me talking. I'm going to be turning my camera off and I'll be supporting any sort of tech related issues that may come up. And I'm going to turn things over to our amazing presenters. Take it away, ladies.
Thank you, Catherine. It reminded me when she once introduced me as a physiotherapist, and I thought, no, I'm not going to give advice in this area. So thank you everyone for being here. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Thank you. Can you all see my screen well? Okay, thank you. It looks a little bit different than usual. I think they did some sort of a upgrade. So we thought it was important to talk about how to support families who are experiencing AFCCA. So today we will be talking about what is actually AFCCA, the impact of this issue on all family members, and how to be a good supporter of individuals who are experiencing AFCCA and their families. This was a request from many caregivers who said, you know what, I do need supporters for my family, but I'm not sure how to ask. I'm not sure what to ask. And a lot of supporters say, I want to help, but I'm not sure how. And I don't necessarily feel like I'm doing the right thing. So we're hoping to answer those questions. And we don't have all the answers, but please ask away and we'll try to answer the best way we can. And hopefully we can also send resources after if there's anything we did not think of addressing today. So what is AFCCA? AFCCA was not an acronym that existed before. It's actually a really new concept. There's been aggression towards family members coming from children and youth for a very long time, but we didn't necessarily have a name for it. So a few years ago, pre-COVID, and especially during COVID, there was a lot of families who were raising children and youth with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, neurodevelopmental disabilities like autism, ADHD, children who had difficulty with attachment, many trauma in their young life that were exhibiting difficult behaviors, and to an extreme that was sometimes life-threatening for family members, or even life-threatening to them. And sometimes it's not life-threatening, but it's highly traumatic emotionally and physically for all family members. And we're not talking about, you know, a toddler, you know, doing a tantrum in the store for a candy. We're talking about a pattern of behaviors that is happening frequently, and it is traumatic for people who are experiencing it or witnessing it. So we're talking about the siblings who may see the other sibling acting aggressively towards them, towards the pets, the grandparents, or the parents themselves. And it does affect all family members. And the impact on family members go as far as impacting their health. Many people who are experiencing AFCCA would say that they have health issues. They may have injuries. Emotionally, it's very difficult. Siblings are reporting very similar issues. And it's impacting their relationship. It's also impacting their ability to engage with other families, with the community, their relationship with the school, for example. And it is a common social problem. It's not just happening in the adoptive community or in families who are raising children with neurodevelopmental concerns. We also say that it's a social problem because we do think that if families had the right support, we will not see such a severe impact, and we will probably see less AFCA happening in families. So Erin will talk about the assumptions that we all have about AFCA.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about our assumptions about AFCA or aggression in the home, we have a little activity. It's called a Slido. So I'll flip to the next, or Maude, you can flip over if you want. So you can go to slido.com, or you can just scan the QR code that's there. And that'll pull up a little poll, and basically we can type into the chat what are our assumptions about AFCA. So what do you think of when you hear that there is aggression in the home, or that a child is being aggressive towards their family or their pets or in the community? And so if you can just go in and type in a few things that you're thinking, you can submit as many as you want. And then I have it where I can see the poll answers, and then we can kind of go from there and see what we're thinking. Okay, I see some coming in. People that are angry, fear, poor parenting, mental health, lack of parenting. Yeah, absolutely. Feeling ashamed. Yeah, absolutely. Parenting issues, trauma, rage. Regular child behavior.
Mhm.
Yeah, we hear that one a lot. That this is just normal. This is what kids do. Yeah, isolating, stress. Yeah, it's normal for teens. Yeah. I'm sure we've all heard that. Awesome. I see
Traumatic
lots.
is actually bigger right now, probably because several people said traumatic.
Yeah.
You see it on like it, that's how it shows up on my phone.
Yes.
Terrifying.
Stigma. Absolutely. Yeah, I can see a couple more people typing there. These are all really good ones. Siblings impacted hugely. Yeah. Feeling the blame. No one understands. Definitely. Fear. That one's getting bigger on my screen. Yeah. Families are alone. Shame. Feeling abused. Feel abused. Absolutely. Yeah. And these are definitely the assumptions that we face, right? That sometimes we have assumptions about it, or that, you know, professionals might have that assumption towards us about why we're experiencing this in our home. Zero support. Yeah, I see a lot of that, like it's normal, lack of parenting, normal for normal for teens. Everything's fine, families are alone, isolated. Yeah. Yeah, it seems like a lot of people are having kind of those same ideas, those same thoughts, those same assumptions. Embarrassed, absolutely. I know embarrassment is a really big one, and that shame. And so hopefully during this presentation, we can kind of go through some of those assumptions, and give a little bit of information about how we can, you know, kind of reach out to some of our supporters, or how supporters can help parents that are experiencing AFCA, or caregivers that are experiencing AFCA, and how can we kind of move away from some of these assumptions. Yeah, so embarrassed, shame, angry, fear, traumatic, those are the big ones that it looks like popped up a lot. Perfect. All right, I think that's all the ones coming in. I don't see anyone typing anymore, so do we want to go ahead there? Maude?
And before we change to the next slide, I think I'd like to address some of the things that were written. And I know it's the question is not like, okay, what necessarily are your assumptions, but like what are people assumptions, right? Like professionals or the community. So, but I think it's good to go like see some of them. Like there's one that said normal in teenagehood. And I think this is something that comes up a lot where when parents are sharing their experience, people say, oh, it's normal, he's just a teen. But most teenagers may act oppositional or do things that are maybe like risky at times, but we're talking about behaviors that are non-typical, they're way over the norm in terms of risky behaviors that is actually compromising the safety of family members or of themselves. There's the shame part as well that we will talk about today. And do kids mean to do it or not? You know, that whole question. And in the UK, and we have Al today from the UK, this issue, they don't call it AFCA, they call it CPVA, which means child to parent violence and aggression. And even an interwoven connection, we used to use CPVA, but it really did not feel right for caregivers and professionals and people with the living experience. And they all said it sounds blaming towards the child to parent violence and aggression, or abuse. Some people write abuse as well in the acronym. So we did a big consultation that was national. Several of our provinces were represented. We had clinicians, researchers, young people who had been displaying aggression as young people, their caregivers, over 100 caregivers participated, policymakers. I feel like I'm missing a few people, but we have, I'll send a link. We have a website and it's called the National Consortium on AFCA. And the first step was actually naming the issue. It has a name. And together they chose the term AFCA, aggression towards family members during childhood and adolescence, because we needed to name when it happens, what it is. And when we were using terms like dysregulation, yes, maybe they're emotionally dysregulated, but it didn't capture the experience of family and the severity of the impact. Like when we're talking about someone ending up at the hospital, you know, having their child going to live somewhere else, for example, dysregulation did not really capture the experience. So professionals were not like, oh, okay, we really need to support, right? You can just, that's always my example. Maybe I'm going to picture as a professional, oh, the kid's jumping on the couch, but that's not what we're talking about, right? And also I have to mention, we call it AFCA, but in some families, it goes beyond adolescence. Sometimes it's entrenched and it goes beyond, you know, adolescence. And it's also in something that happens in adulthood for some families. I also want to mention when we're saying, okay, is it poor parenting, lack of parenting? Is it their disability? You know, in the consortium research, we saw that a lot of children and youth who were displaying AFCA had a diagnosis of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So that's when there's an exposition of alcohol prenatally. Autism, mental health disorders like anxiety, depression. Many of the children represented had learning disabilities along with complex diagnosis of mental health, attachment disruption, complex trauma. We call it here developmental trauma. It's the same thing, just a different name. Although I want to mention that not everyone who has a diagnosis of mental health, FASD, or autism will display aggressive behaviors. Not all of them, but certainly when your brain is wired differently, it may lead to behaviors that are not appropriate. That's why it's more represented in this population. So that might be an assumption sometimes that, okay, maybe they don't parent well, but whenever you have a child with a complex, like several diagnoses, sometimes we say the alphabet soup of diagnosis, quite often what we see is a very high level of parenting. They're actually really good and able to maybe give a class on parenting. However, the child's behavior may not be representative of the parent's ability to parent the child. So very often in our society, we'll look at children and go, okay, if they misbehave, we think, okay, it's about the parenting, but not in these circumstances. And we'll talk about it more later. Is there something else in the Slido, Erin, that for you was like, yeah, I'd like to talk about maybe this aspect, like maybe embarrassed, fear? I don't know if you want.
Yeah, I was thinking about that just as you were saying, the embarrassment piece, right? Especially with, in our society, we do feel that kids are often a reflection of their parenting. And so I feel that embarrassment big time, that I suspect that people are thinking that I'm a terrible parent a lot of the time. And so I think that embarrassment, that shame, that fear, and we will talk about it a little bit more too, but it really does lead to that isolation of not necessarily wanting to go out in public, or not wanting to have friends over anymore, or family members coming over anymore, or taking them to family outings, because there is a lot of embarrassment and a lot of fear of what's going to happen while we're there. Sometimes it goes really well, sometimes it doesn't. And so I find that embarrassment piece is a big one, in our family for sure.
The embarrassment, and a lot of parents, when we did this consultation, talked about the shame part, and that's often what leads to isolation. And I think most people, even when I adopted, I think people around me were very well-meaning, wanting to help. And also I would say that the recommendation was like, oh, okay, for attachment, you need to be alone with your child. And it's not a community approach. It's like only the primary caregivers have to, focus on attachment. But what we've been realizing for children who have this level of complexity, they need a community to raise them. And when we have these behaviors and we think we're supposed to do it alone, and it relies on us as parents to manage the behaviors, we're not going to go ask for help, right? It's so outside our culture, in North America to do that, for most of us anyway. And so what we also realize is that violence and aggression thrives in secrecy. Whenever parents are able to have the right people talk to them about what's actually happening, they feel a lot less isolated, which is part of like feeling better and improving the quality of life. Like, I'm not alone in this. Like, there's other parents who are going through this, and also having the support of family members, neighbors, friends goes a really long way. When you have this level of complexity in terms of diagnosis, sometimes it's not about changing the child's behavior. Sometimes we manage to improve the child's functioning and behaviors, but sometimes it's not possible. So we're focusing on other things, like improving the quality of life of caregivers. And that means, for me, when I was able to have support and I was able to just go do sports again and feel like a human again, it really improved my quality of life. So I think when we're looking at this, in terms of supporter, it's like, how can supporters help in like validating the experience of caregivers, not minimizing, oh, it's all, it's in every family. It's not. And it's not about the parenting. And yes, talk about it, because you don't want to be isolated with it. Your turn.
Yeah. No, and that really, I didn't want to jump the gun because I knew it was coming here, but when you're talking about how violence really thrives in that silence, that has been certainly our experience. And so when we were able to start pulling in some of those supporters, which is exactly what we're talking about today, we did notice a big shift in isolation and of feeling some of those feelings of shame and guilt and fear. And so I think it's really important to get creative with supporters, and that's part of what we're talking about as well. And so when I originally thought of supporters, I assumed it was people that had to be like physically close to us, that were able to actually show up on our doorstep and maybe take him out for a couple hours, or, you know, like a respite type situation. But really, there's lots of creative ways that we can use supporters. And so I think this is a great graphic of kind of looking, so, you know, having friends for the child and being able to utilize some after school activities, and those types of pieces, family, friends, the siblings, the extended family members, teachers, social workers, family, friends. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. And one thing that I have found really helpful in our family was having, so we did the NVR program through the AFCCA team, which is the Nonviolent Resistance. And I think that this supporters piece was the most helpful and most impactful to us. And so I was excited that we were going to be sharing some more information about this. So, some of the ways that we've kind of gotten creative with supporters is having people that we're just able to phone on the telephone even. And so in those kind of moments where things are really overwhelming or he's getting really aggressive, being able to have kind of a list of people, because often in those really big moments, our brains aren't necessarily running at the best either. And so we physically wrote out a list that we keep in our room. And so being able to go and pull from that list, and sometimes we use a phone call. We have neighbors sometimes that are able to just pop over. I love the trick that they had suggested about just having somebody come and knock on the door and ask to borrow an egg or a cup of sugar or something like that, because sometimes that was just enough to kind of shake the balance and stop kind of some of that aggression in its tracks. And so we were able to kind of divide different levels of aggression for different types of supporters. And that seems to have really helped. So being able to call on a neighbor to come and just interrupt the cycle. We have some family members that we call when things get really escalated. And it was really important for us to maintain kind of a standard script that we had asked our supporters to use with our child. And so we've developed that script. Everybody's kind of saying the same things to the child. It's not shaming, it's not blaming. It really does come from a place of love and support. And so it was important for us to get creative with who we were going to pull in. And basically everybody comes in and says the same idea of that, you know, we heard that you had a really tough time. You know, we're worried about you. We're worried about your moms. We love your family and we want everybody to be safe. And how can we help you next time that you're feeling like this? And so it has made an impact on his behavior a little bit, but it also has really made an impact on us. And I know for my wife in particular, like really noticing that community of supporters has made a huge difference. And so it was a really scary conversation to have at first. And I'll be honest, I was really embarrassed about it. And I still am sometimes. I still feel that shame a little bit when things have gone off the rail and I'm, oh man, we've got to call Papa again. But but putting it into perspective has really been helpful. And my wife is really good at kind of reeling me back in there of saying, you know, like, it's not a punishment, it's not meant to shame, it's not blame, it's just we have to follow through with this. And when we are consistent with it, I do find that it makes a big impact. And so I think something that's been really important for us too is in between those hard moments, trying to find times where they can have interactions that are positive at the same
Yeah.
time. So a positive phone call, or a video call just for fun, or, you know, mailing them a letter just for fun. Because that's always my big fear, is I didn't want to erode the relationship either, right? He does have a pretty good relationship with my dad or with my mom. And so I didn't want to erode that relationship either, but it's really quick. It's that same script kind of all the time. It's not punitive. It's not, you know, you've been bad and now we have to call Papa. You know, it really is that Papa's really worried about us, or Nana's really worried. So we've pulled them in, we've pulled his respite worker in as well, and she's been fantastic to be able to just call up as well. Like I said, we have our neighbors, even the school sometimes were important. Obviously, you know, it's the summertime, so that's not as helpful right now. But even when we look at this supporters kind of graphic here, it's also not necessarily just in those hard moments. It's ways that we can offload some of our not responsibilities, but of our tasks, right? And of our load, our mental load, our physical load. How can we offload a little bit of that, to give a little bit more breathing room in between the hard? So yeah, I don't know.
Question, Erin. And
Yeah.
I think and then after, I kind of want us to address some of the comments in the chat. And thank you, people who aren't in the chat. Thank you for making comments. It helps us, you know what to address. But I think I'd like to talk about the barriers of asking for help. Or the challenges. Maybe barriers is not the right word, but like it comes with like,
Yeah.
At first when I suggest that to families, they're like, I'm not gonna tell other people what my child's doing. Like they want to protect their confidentiality, or they're embarrassed, or they're like, I don't have anyone. Or it's not gonna change the child's behavior, which is not even what we really are aiming for, right? So I don't know, do you want to talk about maybe your
Yeah.
challenges?
I think, oh, you flipped the slide there, Maude.
Oh, I didn't, but I think they're thinking it's getting too long.
Oh.
We're fine.
Yeah. So I think some of the barrier was definitely that shame and embarrassment. And we really didn't want people to see how badly we were struggling either. It doesn't feel very nice to say, you know, my kid's hurting me on a regular basis, or eroding that relationship. Like I had kind of said, you know, in our family, he's the first grandchild, and so everybody loves him, and he is lovely. Don't get me wrong, he has some really, really lovely parts about him, and they often only see those parts. And so it was really challenging to reach out and say, like, hey, like, we're getting hurt here, and it's not good. So I know that embarrassment and fear of how it would impact their relationships was a big one for us. And also his level of embarrassment too, right? I'm sure it doesn't feel very nice sometimes to be so out of control, and then there's these people that are hearing about it. But it really I thought it would be more isolating, but it really has done the opposite. The more people that we have let in, the more I think he feels connected to other people, and we feel connected to other people. And so what I initially thought, it actually has been kind of the opposite. So I don't know if there was anything else in particular that you were thinking of, Maude, as the
Thank
barrier.
you. I was also reading the comment.
Yeah, I haven't seen them yet. I'm gonna take a peek through while you're.
Yes, and these are really good concern, and what's described in the chat, like what they will think about my child, or sometimes it's not the right supporters. And it's true that a lot of us who are raising children with complex mental health, complex trauma, FASD, we've sort of been burned by the system that people don't understand, and it's not like we're asking for help, they don't give it to us, it's not the right support. But then we're also talking to supporters and they're like, I want to help, but they don't know how. So that's kind of what this is about. Now we're going to talk more about like the practical aspects of being a supporter and rallying supporters. Sometimes I also say, in nonviolent resistance, which is what Erin was talking about, we describe attachment as a strong anchor. So the parent has to be a strong anchor for the child when they are dysregulated and for, their general well-being. But that anchor cannot be alone. Like, we're actually the supporters, their main role is to support that anchor, making it strong. And sometimes it means giving practical help. Can I give rides to your child? Bring them to the dentist if possible. Take something off your plate. Is it just validating your experience? Hear how you're doing. Is it just you don't want to talk about it and you just want to go have an activity? And unfortunately, our system, it's true, it's not made to support families who are experiencing AFCA. It's just not. And so AFCA is a systemic issue. It's not a family issue. It is systemic. But we have to go with what we have currently in the system, and that means rallying supporters that are often in our own network and how to do that. And it's also like, I guess it's our role too as professionals to train CAS, CAS is child protection here in Ontario, and having professionals understanding the experience of families who are experiencing AFCA and how to support them. This is also what we will talk about. And someone too said in the chat that they knocked at every door and they were not given support. And that's something we hear a lot in the consortium. There's many stories, if you go on the website, that describes how, they did knock on the doors. Like, most of these families, they've tried everything and they were not given the right support. And I've witnessed so many families being judged. So part of the role of supporters, sometimes it's like, I do that all the time. I know, Erin, you do that as well. And I do that as a caregiver, of bringing another professional that I know has my back in those meetings. And usually, professionals behave better. And so you're not alone. It's actually strengthening your anchor to feel supported and regulated. And here is what we heard from caregivers. Oh, that's you, Erin.
Oh, keep going. You're good.
Okay, I'll do a little bit and then you add to it.
Yeah.
What we heard from caregivers is, the first one is validating their experience. Someone said in the chat, yes, when I was talking about dysregulation, and they're like thinking it's minor. No, it's big. And it's a spectrum. AFCA is a spectrum. Sometimes it's life-threatening. Sometimes we're more talking about aggressions or like verbal abuse, but it's so repetitive that parents actually become traumatized. And validating without stigmatizing the child, but validating, yes, what you're experiencing is really hard and you do need support and the siblings need support. So sometimes it's hard for professionals or supporters to, not talk against the child, but also say, yes, that's really hard to the parent. And acknowledge their feelings. Yes, the parents do need help. And in our culture, it's sort of like we're supposed to do it alone, not ask for help. But in many cultures, you're not supposed to raise your child alone. And especially if your child has neurodevelopmental disabilities, you probably need more than a village. I think it's Al who said, you don't need a village to raise these children. You need a city. It's complex to raise a neurotypical child, let alone kids who have been, who have faced difficulties like attachment difficulties and trauma. And we know now that children who have neurodevelopmental disabilities will live in interdependence when they're older. Interdependence is that we all need each other. And really, all of us need other people to function, but more so people who have neurodevelopmental disabilities. So it's better to start when they're younger to normalize getting support, normalize getting help, not being the only caregiver, to bring them to their appointments or do some of the parenting task chores. It's probably not the right word. And really collaborating, like whenever we've been, I think, successful in supporting a family is that we had like, you know, the child hospital not working in silos, working with us and working with the caregivers, and even having other supporters like the uncle coming to those appointments and like do those supporters meeting to make sure everyone's aware, everyone sends the same message, and to avoid triangulation, which is something we will talk about today. And destigmatize, yes. And finding a balance between saying, oh, it's normal. It's not like just typical, you know, experience, but it's also not like, it is normal in this context to have AFCA. It's very common when you have children with a very different brain. What would you like to add? Like, would you say, Erin, as a caregiver, this is what you need? Is there something else or?
Yeah, the validation I think is a really big one. And we just had a good kind of example of that where, you know, my mom had said to us at one point, just fairly recently, she's like, you know, you've done more parenting in 3 years with him than I did in the 18 years that I had you and your sister around. And it made me feel so good, but also so sad at the same time, right? That like it's really important to recognize those pieces, and it felt really good to hear like, okay, yeah, you guys are doing way more than a lot of parents have to do. And so it felt really good to be seen and to be heard that, you know, kind of like what you're saying, it's not normal, but it is normal in the context of kind of the life that we're living. So I think that also really did acknowledge the feelings of how hard it is, right? And that we are working really hard and we are doing our best. And I think a lot of parents are just really doing a lot more than a lot of other parents are doing, and that's exhausting too. And to hear somebody say like, hey, I see how hard you're working, without judging, without saying, you know, like, why aren't you doing more, or how come there's been no changes yet, or why is he still acting like this? It was none of that. It was very much a loving, just like, I see how hard this is and I see how hard you're working. Just being seen, I think, is really important.
Thank you, Erin. And so someone said earlier, I can't remember how she put it, but like, oh, you chose to adopt. So like, you know, deal with it kind of thing. And I think even if someone doesn't say it, most of us as adoptive parents, we feel like that. Like, okay, I chose this. It's not easy. So we don't want to bother other people. But I think it's changing our narrative around it. Is like, okay, actually, we're not going to force anyone who doesn't want to be involved. But like, most people want to help. And they see children, okay, this is, I don't want to say community project, but children should be cared for by communities. And what does it look like? And what can we ask? And then an experience, now that we're changing the narrative, I see that so many people say, yes, I do want to do something. I just don't know what to do. And many of them do something and then they feel like, okay, I didn't do the right thing. I aggravated things, you know? So, okay, finding that balance too, I think.
And along with that, I think that has been the most helpful with getting that meaningful support from our supporters, is we have told them exactly what to do, exactly what to say, how to do it, right? And they don't stray from that very far. Sometimes there's a little extra conversation, but we've also set it as a rule that it, like, when we call to have those conversations, then when the conversation's done, we're not going on and talking about our day and like, you know, when we're going to see you next, or having a nice conversation afterwards. This is the script that we are following. This is all we need from you for today. And then kind of like I was saying before, we always try and follow up the next day maybe with something that's a little bit more positive so that it's not eroding that relationship, but we're also not, because you know, our son loves to call his grandparents, and so that's not a fun call those days. It's a supportive call, but they're really scripted, and I think that's helped them help us because they didn't know what to do a lot of the time. Right? But it's a lot easier when you're being told exactly what is needed.
Yes. And you have a child, but a lot of parents who are raising teenagers, especially when they are doing this transition towards adulthood, their level of influence as parents is really like going down. And a lot of parents still want to parent and be that person of reference for their child, but there's so many other influence. And usually the young person is like, this is an age where they think the parents knows nothing, you know? So having those supporters, what it can look like I know this family who has a daughter with FASD, the hairdresser actually talks to their young person about hygiene. Like hygiene is very difficult. So the hairdresser would show her like, how do you wash your face? How do you shower? How do you, all these things. And because they know for years, they have that relationship. And she also has this older lady in the street who knits, and she can knit with that lady, and they're having conversations together. Also, it really depends of the level of aggression we're dealing with, right? And if you have a school that understands AFCA, and we're increasingly having schools understanding AFCA, not all of them, they can also be supporters in like saying, yes, you know, we know this is what happened with mom yesterday. How can we be a supporter? And for some young people, aggression will go down. In some situations, it doesn't have any impact. It doesn't change anything in terms of the child's behavior. Sometimes it does. If it doesn't change this child behavior, what we're seeing is that the parent will say, I'm not as isolated as I was before. I'm feeling supported. I have a better quality of life, and they feel more connected. Isolation is something we see a lot in AFCA. And the longer it's been going on, the more severe the isolation can be. And it's harder to pull ourselves out of this situation. So when we think of supporters, we often think about de-escalation support, like the person, like the neighbor coming into your home or putting them on speakerphone, for example. Yes, that's one way to help. Respite, for sure. But sometimes it's only having that friend that you can call and say, you know what, I don't want to talk about this today. Let's just go for a walk. A lot of people who identify as fathers would say, most of the time, what I need is just to go for a beer and talk about something else, right? Like just having that connection with someone else. We all need something different. And the question is, what do you need to improve your quality of life right now, beyond your child's behavior? And the answer is different for everybody. I'm just going to look at the chat at the same time. Yeah, they're talking about support groups as well. So in some situations, you have the child going to live with someone else or in therapeutic home. And at Interwoven Connections, we have different groups. We don't have one currently specific to what we sometimes call adoption disruption, but I try to stay away from this word because sometimes, like most of the time, parents still have a good relationship with their child, but they just live somewhere else. And with nonviolent resistance, we had a group where families were using the NVR principles, but all of them, they had the child living with someone else. Different situations, but there were still very much parenting, but from a distance. And this is also something that we don't see it as ideal, but we also try to normalize that some young people who have severe attachment difficulties will need to live somewhere else at some point. And what does it look like when there's AFCA? What's the best way to approach it? And what's the best way to destigmatize this situation and support the family member in this process? Okay. And this section is really focusing on like, what do we say to supporters? So if today you say, I'm a supporter, I tried to help them, I don't know how. I would say like even my family, when I adopted, at some point they said, we're trying to help or say something, but like we feel like we just never do the right thing. And I get it because they see me like, okay, she's a clinician and she has all those trainings and I do parent differently. And I have to. Most of us have to parent differently because our kids' brains are not the same as a neurotypical person. Children who have fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, for example, they don't learn from consequences and punishment. So many of us will not use this approach. We will often use a co-regulation. So co-regulation means I will help you with your feelings. So if they have really big feelings, we may be more inclined to sit with them or close by, avoid screaming or avoid talking too much. And this is when like a lot of caregivers would say, well, I asked my neighbor to come, my child was really dysregulated, and they started screaming at my child. So that wasn't very helpful. And then when we talk to the supporter, they're like, yes, but they just need to be told. Or I think that, if they did that or they give more consequences, then the child will stop. So there's sort of a clash in like the parenting skills or the specialized trainings that parents have when they adopt or do kinship, foster care, versus parents who've been great parents, but to children who are neurotypical, who don't have the attachment and trauma difficulties. So what we say, and Erin's going to talk about it more, is we need to follow the caregiver's lead. All our caregivers, they have extensive trainings and the clinical resources most of the time to have a plan and what to do. And yes, most supporters would say, I got it wrong this time. And as parents, we get it wrong too. I get it wrong very often because even as a clinician, I don't know everything. And there's situations where we're tired and it's beyond, it's beyond what we can handle. So I think it's being understanding that they do know most of the time how to do things, being a supporter, asking what do you need in these moments, follow their lead, and you will see that they will parent differently. And depending on what the diagnosis, if it's a diagnosis of autism or FASD, you can ask for more information if you're interested in like, how do you parent a child who has these types of difficulties? The last thing I want to talk about is parenting out of fear versus with a plan. This is maybe less for supporters, but we do encourage parents to have a plan and be less of like first responders, right? Whenever there's a fire, we just try to extend the fire. We really want to have a safety plan, and we have resources on our YouTube page for safety planning. We also want to have a plan in who you call. What do you say? And this is something you prepare in advance with your supporters. So there's a plan in place, kind of what Erin, you were describing, whenever there's an issue. And we're also focusing on preventing those issues. So the parents feel supported, children feel supported. And when there's something happens and your brain is kind of like, whoa, this is, you're in fear, the plan takes over more than your fear and your dysregulation. Do you want to add anything to it, Erin?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that when we started making that shift, I found sometimes we felt like we couldn't give in ever, because that was going to like perpetuate the cycle of violence. Is like, he wanted something or whatever the situation may be. But when we knew the plan and we knew what we were doing a little bit more, sometimes it was okay to give in if we knew that this was the plan, right? In the car, for example, like if it's not safe in the car and he's really upset about something, like it's okay to diffuse that by giving in or by distraction or by, like a different way than we would normally parent. And instead of it being, reactive, that was the plan. We knew that in certain situations, it's okay to parent differently than we kind of normally would to keep everybody safe and to make sure that everything was kind of okay. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but sometimes the plan was letting go of the reins, and that was okay because it was in a situation where that's what it called for. Yeah. Yeah, I see the comment there about being able to reframe giving in as making different choices that are better for everyone changed how I feel about the difficult days. 100%. Yeah. Because it feels like we have to be on all the time and so consistent and so, like intentional about everything that we do, that sometimes it is okay just to keep everybody safe or to plan differently or to go a different route, knowing what's coming. And that is the plan.
I just realized that we also had questions in the Q&A. Louise is asking if we have a script for one of those requests for help. We do, and we will send them with the PowerPoint. There's another question that is too specific to the family situation, so we're not really able to answer that live. However, generally speaking, the question is like, does this apply for verbal aggression? It's the same thing. So today we're not necessarily talking about de-escalation techniques and all that. We're talking more about how to rally supporters, and the process is the same regardless of the issue. So like, there's different patterns, right? Like there's like some youth use a lot of verbal aggression, daily screaming, making threats of harming others, self-harm, threats of suicide. Sometimes it's physical aggression, and there's the children who are hiding in the basement, playing video games all day long, and basically you don't see them ever. That's another kind of AFCA that we've been seeing. But the process is very similar in terms of rallying supporters. Is it about the child or is it about you, how you feel as a parent? And I would say that when I did my training in nonviolent resistance, this aspect of rallying supporter is central to NVR, and I use it a lot now, even in situations that are not related to aggression. For example, when my son started driving and has a mental disability, I was like asking neighbors to have an eye on him. Some people even have cameras in the car, and they have different people, looking at what's happening. I also had my brother-in-law calling him, see how things were going, like some of the choices he was making. So it's not just for extreme situation. It's something that the more we normalize it, the more we're able to use it in extreme situations. And I keep repeating this, maybe they won't change their behaviors, but at least you're not the only person having the influence on your child.
Yeah. And I would say too that a lot of what we were experiencing was a lot of verbal aggression. And so that's where we kind of created that hierarchy of responses. So, if it was extreme verbal aggression, we were responding with one set of supporters. If it happened to go into the physical escalation, well, then it was a different kind of group of supporters that we would call on for that. And so being able to kind of differentiate your level of response, I found was really helpful for us as well.
Yes, and someone, just to add, someone said in the chat, like, people made us feel like we were giving in. And that's when it's like parenting differently. There's things that are really important in parenting, but when there's AFCA, they're not as important, right? And maybe we will address them later. And this is something we also do with nonviolent resistance. We have a small basket exercise where we are only going to be focusing and using our supporters for what really matters in that small basket. And maybe like for some caregivers, it's even as bad as, we're not going to deal with the school right now. We're going to deal with the mental health and the aggressive behaviors and keeping everyone safe. and then the school can wait a little bit longer, right?
Mhm.
But if you say that to the general population, sometimes they think, what? It makes sense in their in their field and their experience. Okay, next. So FASD, I'm not gonna give an FASD 101. We have one, Interwoven Connection, FASD 101. You'll see me when I was younger, still had the same accent if you want to learn more. But just a quick note on it. So FASD, like I said, it's when there's prenatal alcohol exposure to the fetus, and it does lead to physical problems, like even health issues, but mostly brain damage. So the brain is formed differently, and what we see is a lot of behaviors that are risky, dangerous, inappropriate. Not all of them have these behaviors, but they're more common in this population. A big myth is that they have facial features from it, but only 10% of them have the facial features. Most of them will have difficulty sleeping. A lot of them also have trauma and attachment difficulties, even if they were adopted at a very young age. What we see is it's difficult for them to learn from consequences. So their judgment in terms of their decision-making is not ideal. They confabulate a lot. Confabulation is a memory issue. So let's say they're talking about what happened yesterday. You know, if I say, Erin, what did you have for dinner yesterday? Maybe she'll be like spaghetti. Someone with FASD may fill in the gap with, oh, I saw someone eating hot dogs on TV, and they'll say hot dogs, but actually they saw it on TV. They're not lying necessarily, but that's what they think, right? That's their memory issue. And also the difficulty with impulse control, like regulating their feelings. A lot of them have depression, anxiety, most of them actually. And maybe you witness situations where you're like, oh, you know, that young person went from 0 to 100, but actually they're never at 0. They're more like at 95 all the time. So it's easy to get to 100. Executive functioning issue is anything that is about getting organized, initiating a task, remembering what needs to be done. Even when you're doing something like, we call it working memory, like it's really short memory, is a big issue for them. And the dysmaturity. So usually they're emotionally much younger than they are chronologically. So like a 12-year-old may be acting more like a 6-year-old in some area, and like a 12-year-old in other area. Like they have the hormones of a teenager, but they may act and think about things like a 6-year-old. Many of them will have sensory issues as well, like people with autism. So that may lead to difficulties with hygiene, difficulties, you know, dealing with the light, the sound. And these difficulties, sometimes they lead to really difficult behaviors and dangerous behaviors. So that's why we see more of the FASD represented with AFCA. I'm just gonna check. Oh, yes, she sent the link for the FASD 101. Thank you, Catherine. So I wanted to talk a bit about this triangulation. I mentioned it before, and maybe Erin, you can give an example after I explain it. This is what happens sometimes with supporters. I guess that's one of the challenge. You know, there's pros and cons to talking to people, we'll say it, I guess. Common example, I work at the school, for example. I work with Erin's son. I'm making this up, by the way. We really don't live close by. And then, you know, her son comes to me and says, you know, Mom didn't feed me yesterday. And, you know, this is something that can happen with FASD. They make up stories. And I would be like, she didn't feed you? I'm going to call CS, or I'm going to talk to another worker. And like, and then you feed this, and then maybe you'll be like, I'll feed you today so you don't have to work. And they think, oh, maybe tomorrow I want to be fed instead of working. So it's called triangulation. It's like when you don't have the same story, you don't go check with the caregiver. That can lead to false accusation. That could also lead to lack of trust between the supporter and the parent. So we really encourage supporters to go check with the caregiver, follow their lead, ask for what's really happening. in therapy, it's the same thing. Sometimes therapists are like, no, your child needs confidentiality, but we really need, from research, I tell you, we need to ask caregivers to be involved in the therapeutic process for individuals who have neurodevelopmental disabilities. So I don't know, do you want to give examples, Erin?
Yeah, no, I think that was a good one. And I find sometimes it, like, then it does shift the alliance a little bit, right? Where the kid is using that supporter purposefully, you know, their needs are getting met in a different way by that supporter, and then it's pitting the parent against and creating more gaps with the parent. So I think Catherine had said, or somebody had said, I think it was Catherine, sometimes it's helpful to learn who shouldn't be in your support circle as well. And that is just as helpful as finding the right supporters, but it's also okay to recognize that, like, oh, this person is not working as our supporters maybe should, right? They're not in our corner the way that we want them to be. And I think it's worth kind of having a conversation about that, but generally, like, when we reach out to our supporters, we usually give them a bit of a rundown of the story, like through a text, for example. So I'll like text my dad and be like, this is what happened today. Would you mind giving him a call? And then he asks, knowing our version of the story, he'll say, you know, like, oh, what happened today? But then he's able to kind of redirect the conversation, knowing what our perspective of the situation was. So that's one way that we've tried to avoid it a little bit, because I think it's often easy for people to hear these stories and be like, oh my goodness, that sounds so terrible. I can't believe your mom was so mean to you today. Like, she wouldn't even let you go fishing, for example. But like, he's been fishing for 2 hours already and it was time to come back and he just didn't want to leave, you know? So I think being able to lay that foundation a little bit ahead of time, not in front of the child necessarily, because that's where you're going to get into those struggles, maybe of, no, that's not how it happened, or but yeah, making sure that they're aligned with what your goals are and what your, like, hopeful outcome of the situation is, I think is important.
Very much so, especially someone with FASD, intellectual disabilities, are very in the moment. So I remember when in my practice, the child will come in, or the young person, I would say, how's the week? They'll be like, great. And the parents like, in the background. Like, so you do want to maybe like meet the parents first. I know that some people are use platforms like WhatsApp to kind of talk about, okay, this is what's happening. Here's the right information. There's other platforms like Ties that I think there was someone from Lifetime Planning today. And how it's used Ties, you have all the information about the child. Some of it is confidential, so not everybody who's a supporter has access to all the information, but sometimes it's the calendar. Everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. And some families choose to have something a lot more formal in terms of supporting the family and having different roles. So to recap, how can I help? Like, that's for supporters. The best thing to do is to ask, how can I help you right now? And personally, I took the habit of, like, with my friends now, especially the ones who are experiencing AFCA, I'm like, do they want an advice, or do they want me to just listen, or do you want me to be funny and send funny videos? Do you know what I mean? Like, we don't know. And now I just say, what do you need from me right now? Right? Like, how can I help? And validate the experience. Yes, that's brutal what you're experiencing. And listen rather than give advice, unless they say, what do you think? Right? And I think, and that's the hard part, because most adoptive families and their family, like, no one else has adopted, so they want to give regular parenting advice, which are really bad advice, generally speaking, if they don't have the trauma training or the FASD training. And believe them in their story. A lot of parents say, I don't feel like they believe me. They think I'm exaggerating. They think I'm crazy. so believing their version of their story, and if you can offer practical advice, please do, you know, like even bringing the child to some of these appointments, because these kids have a lot of appointments.
Drop
Would you
off a
add something,
like
Erin?
a gift card if they're so overwhelmed, right? Drop
True.
off a gift card to McDonald's so that, you know, one night this week they can go and pick up dinner and not have that on the plate too. Or, you know, drop off a meal or something. I find, you know, not everybody's in the position to do that necessarily, and not all of the time, but you know, some of those more practical things like that, like, oh, I'm going to Walmart, do you need anything? You know, just like saving some of those, you might not be able to, and I heard someone else say that, like, I don't want to pull other people in because I don't feel like they know my child as well as I do. And that's often very true. And we found that respite was almost not helpful sometimes because he would come home more dysregulated, or, you know, like being away from home was tiring. So some of those other pieces, taking something else off of the plate other than the parenting piece, can be just as helpful, I find. In the practical support ways, right?
I was thinking of something else, but now I don't remember. Oh, yes. Okay, now I remember. Okay, the system is very child focused, as most of you know. So they're always like asking about the child, how they're doing. And I've noticed whenever in our program we ask caregivers, how are you doing? They go, so my son is, and we're like, no, you, how are you? Like, right? And like the parents are so involved and committed to the child's well-being, and the system so focused on the child. Have friends who say, no, you, how are you doing? Right? As a person, it's also a person, and your life matters as a parent, and as a person, as a human, right? We all have needs, not just our kids have needs. So please ask your questions. You may have noticed that we are used to be called Adopt for Life. Now we're called Interwoven Connection. We have a website. Our YouTube page has the AFCCA Caregiver series with tons of information. We also have a short video made by someone on our team named Jan, and she talks about how she used supporters. She was very creative with it. And we will be sending the consortium information, the slides, and anything relevant to what we discussed today.
Yes, absolutely. And I'll make sure to send the webinar links and all of the resources that were talked today. I'll include that in the email as well. I do see there's one question that just popped in. Sorry, I'm just reading it now.
Yes, in a Q&A, I can answer this part. I don't know if, do people see the question, Catherine, in the Q&A?
Oh, no. Do you want me to read it? I'll read it out. One thing I struggle with is when aggression happens, it's impactful on me physically and emotionally, but careful not to blame and shame my kiddo, as they feel so guilty and so awful about themselves, and it really eats away at their self-esteem and their sense of self so bad that their mental health. I always reinforce that they're wonderful and that they're not the problem, but the behavior is hard. It's not their essence. We'll figure it out together. How to set boundaries and how to protect their self-esteem.
Yeah, and that's a fair question. We hear all the time, like, what if I, talk to other people, they talk to them, is it bad for their self-esteem? I think it's how it's done, kind of what Erin was talking about, like having the right script, the narrative, and you'll see, like, when we send the examples, they're formulated that we're saying, like, yes, that's really bad, what's happening, but also like really protecting their well-being. Like when we talk to young adults who had been displaying AFCCA when they were younger, said, it was a way for us to communicate our pain, communicate how dysregulated we were. And they feel bad actually about what happened. I mean, and there's different profile. I can't generalize, you know, like every single situation, but generally speaking, it's true that they will feel bad. They feel shame. And shame, sometimes it's not shown as I feel bad and I want to fix it. Sometimes shame will be minimizing, lying, fighting back, hiding. So we do suggest that there's clinical oversight, if possible, like a therapist to help you navigate how to protect their self-esteem, but also promote healthy guilt in the child. Because with complex trauma and attachment difficulties, sometimes we see more shame, you know, that shame shield I just spoke about, more than the guilt. Guilt is good. Like if I said something to Erin that was hurtful and she would say, Maude, you know, you said that and it hurt my feelings. If I'm healthy emotionally, I would say, oh, I feel guilty about it. I'm sorry. I will try to do my best next time. I will apologize. I won't minimize or lie or, you know, blame, well, it's Catherine, you know, like it's not me. So, and this is common, like our kids do that with attachment difficulties and trauma, and, you know, so, yes, and it's a process to reintroduce healthy guilt in our children more than the shame. That answers the
My
question.
son used to destroy things in his room, like his favorite toys or his Legos, after he had an aggressive outburst, because that was how he would punish himself. And it impacted his self-esteem, much like this. The anonymous participant asked. For us, we found, like, once the initial cool down is starting, we actually use humor in it, and that's how we set the boundary, but still kind of said, like, it's not you, it's the behavior. And yeah, we use a lot of humor, probably humor that people might not appreciate as much, but I know for us it works for our family. So yeah, finding what works, I think, is important. So sorry.
I was just gonna say, I found that using like the word worried or concerned felt a little bit less shameful or less harsh on the child. It was more that, like, I care about you and I'm worried about what's happening. It's not you've done something wrong or you hurt your parents or, you know, you can't act like that. It's more of that concern of like, wow, I'm really worried about you guys. How can we help you? And how can we help your family, and how can we support you guys, as opposed to placing that blame or you know, putting it on the child to change their behavior, which, you know, like Maude said, sometimes we can, sometimes we can't. But I found that because our son also had a lot of that, like, shame, right? And you can see it when we call the supporters. He'll often like hide under his blanket, and then they'll start talking and they'll say, you know, like, oh, I'm really worried about you, like, I'm really worried about your moms. And you can see him like slowly unravel and like come and engage in the conversation. And you know, not every time, but I feel like that's been a big shift for us, is taking it away from like this was bad or something's wrong to like, wow, I'm really worried about you. Has made a big difference of reducing some of that shame, I think.
To find balance sometimes between addressing the behavior and not like shaming them for sure.
We have one final question, and I don't know if we're able to fully answer it, but how do you teach healthy guilt? I love this. I wonder if that needs to be a resource on its own, actually. I think we can do a whole webinar on healthy guilt, but do you have like 2 or 3 points about how to help promote that?
We will have a video coming out soon. So if they watch a caregiver series, they wait a little bit, maybe at the end of the summer. I do talk about shame and guilt. I'll think about sending another resource, probably in like dyadic developmental psychotherapy. It has a lot of resources in terms of like the shame shield. I have one in French. Yes, we'll send a resource. I'm thinking of like, I don't want to mention something and then regret it later. So, but we will send it with the resource saying, okay, this is for like reintroducing healthy guilt and shame. And it's a journey. Okay. And like, I don't want to say you do this, you know, within a week, your kid's going to come to you and say, I apologize. The impact it must have had on you. You know, like,
If only you don't have the magic wand.
I wish, you know, I'd use it on my own kids.
All
Yeah,
right.
someone mentioned humor, you know what, like, and that's part of having supporters. I have my own supporters too, that we just, sometimes it's just sending funny memes and appropriate videos that are funny, you know, like you have to make fun of this because it's too heavy. Right? So like
Yeah.
sometimes that's why I'm like, okay, caregivers can, supporters can ask, like, what do you need right now? I just want to laugh at this, you know, like, okay.
Amazing. So I'm just going to put something in the chat here, and this is how for families and professionals who are watching who aren't a part of Interwoven Connections, this is how you can register with us. Registration is free. If you're a professional or if you're outside Ontario, you'll be able to get access to resources and our monthly newsletter to be part of webinars and learnings like this. If you are an adoptive kin or customary care family and you are in Ontario, you're able to get access to support groups, a lot of other supports, one-on-one support through people like Erin, who are peer connectors. So we really appreciate you guys coming on. We're always looking for feedback. So any information that you'd like to share with us, if you have a spark for another webinar that you want to see, we love hearing that as well. We want to be able to make sure this content is useful and that it's something that you're going to get the most out of. So as we said before, within this week, I'm going to be sending you an email with a copy of this recording, of all the resources that we spoke about, including the Caregiver series, because it's so incredible. And I know a lot of people get a lot out of it, as well as any other resources that were mentioned within this webinar. So Maude and Erin, thank you both so much for sharing your experiences and sharing this information, and for all of you participating and watching. We appreciate it, and we hope you guys have a good rest of your day. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a great day.